Hi friends, it's Kristen with Hooks, Books, and Wanderlust, and today I'm here with another video in my Crochet 102 series all about yarn substitution and WPI. Today we're going to talk about why you might need to substitute yarn in a pattern that you're working, and what all that information on your yarn label is, and how you use that along with WPI to make the best substitution for your pattern. And by the way, what is WPI, or wraps per inch, and how do you measure it? All of that and more in this video. Most patterns are going to come with a recommended yarn used by the designer to create that pattern. That yarn, combined with the hook size that they have chosen for the pattern, are going to create a fabric that has a specific flow or drape to it, a specific density to the material, and will definitely have an effect on your overall pattern if you decide to change and use a different yarn. So yarn substitution is all about when you need or want to use a different yarn than that which is recommended in the pattern that you are following. So when might you need to substitute yarn? You might need to substitute yarn if the recommended yarn is unavailable. Maybe it's been discontinued, maybe it's not local, it's from another country or not easily obtainable. Maybe that yarn is too expensive or you want to use from your stash. Maybe you prefer a different fiber for personal preferences or allergies or ethical reasons, or maybe you just need to meet gauge and need to choose a different yarn in order to do so. These are all reasons why you might substitute some yarn. In this video, we're going to focus on same weight substitutions. So there can be significant variance across the same weight category of yarn. That's down to factors like fiber, texture, thickness, the construction of the yarn. Is it how many plies does it have? How tightly are they wound? Or is it a roving yarn? And all of this can affect your gauge when you are working with a new yarn than what's recommended in your pattern. Yes, I said the word gauge. So if you missed my previous gauge video, make sure you check that out because you are going to need to swatch a lot when you're trying to substitute yarn. So what do I mean by weight categories? The Craft Yarn Council has standardized yarn by weight, or technically by thickness. They measure the WPI, or the wraps per inch, and assign it to a range that's then categorized by number. You might be familiar with these icons and have seen them on yarn labels. They're not always there, but usually the big name manufacturers for yarn do include them. And as those numbers on those little yarn icons increase in number, then your yarn will increase in thickness or size. So what information is included on your yarn label? In this example, the very first thing that you see is that same icon that we saw in the previous slide, telling you what the yarn weight category is for this yarn, and that it is a CYC5 bulky weight. Now, as discussed in the last slide, that yarn icon may not always be present on your label. What is always present are the yardage, the physical weight of your yarn, the fiber, and the care instructions. So as you can see, the second item here tells you how much yarn is in that skein. That's the yardage. Whether it's shown in yards or meters, or like this one in both, that'll tell you how much actual yarn is included in your skein. Similarly, the next item down shows you how much that specific skein weighs if you put it on a scale. So it's going to be shown either in ounces or in grams, or like again here, in both. Sometimes, but not always, your yarn label might also include a recommended gauge. In these icons here, you can see that it tells you what the gauge is for knitting and for crochet, and what the recommended hook or needle sizes are for those respective gauges. This will give you an idea of how the manufacturer intends for the drape of the yarn to be best shown off. The last arrow on this slide points to the care instructions, which are fairly self-explanatory. This is going to tell you how to properly care and maintain your finished object once you've finished working the pattern with this yarn. The last thing that's on this yarn label that I don't have an arrow pointing to is that little scarf icon. You might see a scarf icon, a blanket icon, or even a sweater icon, and this is the manufacturer's way of telling you how many skeins of this yarn are going to be required to make a basic scarf, sweater, or blanket, respectively, based on their recommended gauge. So what kind of information can be yielded from your yarn label that helps in substituting yarn? Obviously, the first thing is making sure that your yarns are the exact same CYC yarn weight category. Looking at that icon that has the number in it, in this case, a 5 for bulky weight. The next thing is the yardage ratio. The yardage ratio is skein length divided by skein weight. So here I've got two examples for you showing you yards per ounce or meters per grams. Now you can calculate this as yards per gram or meters per ounce as well. The important thing here is that when you're comparing your ratio for the yarn you want to substitute with to the yarn that's been recommended in the pattern, you need to make sure that you're using the exact same units each time so that you're comparing apples to apples. As you can see, these are two different ratios for the exact same yarn. And because my units are different for those ratios, they are vastly different measurements. Another way that you can compare your yarns is using wraps per inch, or WPI. Now, I've briefly mentioned this a few times in the video, so let's define it so that we know what we're talking about. Wraps per inch refers to how many strands of yarn can fit side by side around an object of uniform thickness within an inch's worth of wraps. When comparing yarns, it's really helpful to use Ravelry.com as a resource. Here, you can search their database for the yarn that you're using, and it will pull up the label information, tell you the current status. In this case, you can see that this one has been discontinued, but most importantly, it tells you the wraps per inch for that yarn. So you can make an even comparison between the recommended yarn and the yarn you're considering to substitute just by looking at how many wraps per inch are listed on the Ravelry.com database. Maybe you have lost your yarn label and you don't know what type of yarn you've got and what brand or line of yarn you've got, and you can't look it up on Ravelry. At that point, you can measure wraps per inch yourself. It's actually pretty simple, and I'm going to show you how here. What you need is a ruler, you need an object of uniform thickness, and of course your yarn. It's also helpful if you have the wraps per inch chart from the Craft Yarn Council website. You can definitely look that up, and I will link that in the description box below for you. So what do I mean by an object of uniform thickness? That means that the object you're wrapping your yarn around needs to have the same width across the length that you're wrapping and the same depth across the length that you're wrapping your yarn. Now I've got two different items here. I've got a T-tin lid and a pencil, both of which are examples of uniform thickness. But what I would say here is that different items can yield a different wraps per inch because we tend to wrap tighter around narrower objects like the pencil than we would around wider objects like the T-tin lid. So just be consistent and make sure that when you're comparing the WPIs of different yarns, you're using the same object to wrap your yarn around. So I've got my T-tin lid here, and I'm grabbing my yarn, and I am getting ready to go ahead and wrap this around. I'm going to hold the yarn tail in my left hand as I wrap all the way around this T-tin lid. So I'm going to wrap it loosely, not too tight, just kind of taut but not tight, if that makes sense. And I'm going to wrap more than just 1 inch. Just like in our gauge video, how I said that you'll want to make your gauge swatch larger than whatever the measurement is. Because we're measuring 1 inch and sometimes those end wraps might be a little bit different consistency, I'm always measuring in the center of my wraps. So I want to make it a little bit bigger than 1 inch. So then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to twist the ends together just a little bit to keep those end wraps from moving around on me. And then I can flip it over. And I'm going to just double check that all of my strands are just barely touching. I don't want them like squished in too much because that'll be an inaccurate reading. And then I'll grab my ruler and measure an inch on the edge of any of those inches on that ruler. It doesn't matter as long as it's 1 inch, and then count the wraps. Here I've got a skein of Color Made Easy from Lion Brand, which, as you saw in Ravelry, has been discontinued. So let's substitute for it. Let's take a look at the yarn label and calculate our yardage ratio in yards per ounce, which is 35.29. We know from Ravelry that the wraps per inch is 7, and here's the fiber content at 100% acrylic, and the recommended hook size is 6.5 millimeters. So we're going to take this information and we're going to compare it to the same information for 2 different yarns that I'm considering as a substitute for this yarn. So on the left, I have the original Color Made Easy. On the right is the Premier Chunky Basics or Basics Chunky as my first substitution option. You might notice the cute little tool that I'm using. My stepdad actually made that for me, and unfortunately he does not sell them. But if you look on Etsy and search wraps per inch tool or WPI tool, you'll probably come up with a ton of options of your own. So I've got the 2 yarn labels here for comparison with the Color Made Easy original yarn on the left and the Premier Basics Chunky on the right for my first substitute option. The thing to note here is the first difference is the yardage ratio. It's a difference of 1.86 yards per ounce, which could be a potential issue. The other potential issue is that the recommended hook size of the Color Made Easy is 6.5 millimeters. So if that's what's listed in my pattern as well, and the recommended hook size for my possible substitution is showing a 9 millimeter hook recommended size, that's quite a big difference. So that's when it's going to become very important to swatch and see what the density of the fabric is once you work it up, and to see the size as well, because gauge matters, as we discussed in my last video. Comparing the 2 swatches, you can see that the gauge of the substitute yarn is definitely a lot bigger than the original at 10 stitches by 11 rows compared to 11 stitches by 12 rows. The stitches are bigger, wider, the height, they're taller. The drape, because I'm using the same hook size of the 6.5 millimeter, is also a lot denser. So the fabric itself feels a lot denser. If I was going to use this yarn as a substitute for Color Made Easy, I would definitely have to go up several hook sizes just to get the same drape. And then I would have to adjust for gauge from there. Now let's look at a possible substitution for Hue and Me by Lion Brand. So when I'm comparing the 2 labels for this, you can see the difference is a 4.15 yards per ounce on the ratio, but the hook sizes that are recommended are the same. So let's see how that works up in a swatch. So the first thing I noticed when I was comparing these swatches is that the gauge is the same for this substitute as it was on the first substitute, which are both larger stitches and taller stitches than the original Color Made Easy. That being said, with the recommended hook size being the same as the Color Made Easy, it definitely made this second substitute not as dense as the first substitute. But it is still denser than the Color Made Easy, plus it's larger. What that means here is that if I'm going to use this yarn as a substitute, I am going to probably have to go up a hook size, but maybe not as many hook sizes as the first one. And I will have to definitely adjust for that gauge still because of those stitches being taller. There are a few other factors that you might consider when choosing a yarn for substitution. First, look at fiber characteristics. What's the durability of the fiber that you're using, and what are you making and how is it going to be used? For example, You know, cotton is durable, but it stretches easily. Synthetics are not good for anything that you might use with heat, like a hot pad. Animal fiber breathes really well while it insulates, and silk is very delicate but strong. Things like this can factor into how you are substituting your yarn as well. Also look at the care instructions. Is it machine wash or is it hand wash only? You want to try and keep those things matching as much as you can, because again, it comes down to the final object that you're making and how you're going to be able to care and maintain that object. Like many things, yarn substitution is a game of trial and error. You may never find an exact match for the yarn that is recommended in your pattern, and that's okay. Use the tools that I showed you in this video to find something that's as close as you can get, and then make sure you're testing your gauge to compare that to the pattern and make sure that it's consistent with that. If you're not sure how to measure for gauge, be sure to check out the first video in the Crochet 102 series, Gauge in the Golden Loop, which I'll link in the description box below for you. That's it for this video. If you would like to see this written out in black and white and easy reading, then I will make sure to link the blog post for this tutorial down in the description box for you. Next up in this series is going to be changing colors, so something to look forward to for you, whether you're changing in the middle of a row, at the end of a row, or working in the round and doing either of those options, we'll have you covered. Thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you on the next video. Bye!